Have you ever wondered how people kept their food fresh before electricity existed? Back in medieval times, there were no refrigerators for leftovers or delivery apps when the pantry was empty. People had to rely on clever and sometimes very strange ways to preserve their meals. Some of these methods were impressive, some odd, and others just plain funny. Nowhere was this creativity more visible than in the medieval kitchen. These places were far from the shiny, spotless kitchens we know today. Instead of refrigerators, there were meats hanging from the ceiling, bundles of herbs drying by the fire, and piles of salt everywhere. The kitchen was the center of every home. It was smoky, warm, and filled with the smells of cooking and burning wood. Here is where food was stored and prepared. They kept salted meats, dried vegetables, and piles of bread. None of the modern condiments or gadgets existed back then. Try explaining ketchup or canned soup to a cook from that era. Food storage had to begin in the warmer months because winter was brutal. Once the harvest ended, survival depended on what was already preserved. And their first and most powerful preservation tool was salt. Believe it or not, salt was once so valuable that Roman soldiers were paid with it. That is where the word salary comes from. Amazing, right? In medieval times, merchants in Venice became incredibly rich by controlling the salt trade. These traders were like the business tycoons of their day, except instead of selling technology, they sold grains of white gold. Here is how they used it. Meat and fish were packed or rubbed with layers of salt, sometimes weighing as much as 1/5 of the food itself. The meat would shrink and dry out, which was exactly what they wanted. This process turned it into something close to medieval beef jerky. A 13th century recipe even said the meat should look as if it were covered in snow. Sounds like something that would happen to me if I spilled the salt shaker. The best part was that they salted nearly everything. Fish were packed in barrels filled with alternating layers of salt, like a strange version of lasagna. Pork became ham and bacon. Even vegetables joined in. They made sauerkraut by salting cabbage until it fermented. Medieval doctors actually believed salt was good for health. They would probably be shocked to see modern warnings about sodium today. But there was one big issue with all this salt. It was extremely costly. A single pound could equal a week's pay for a common worker. One old French story tells of a village trading an entire flock of sheep for enough salt to survive the winter. When salt was too rare or too expensive, people turned to another method, smoking, and they took it to the extreme. Entire rooms were filled with thick smoke from cooking fires. If a medieval cook walked into a modern barbecue restaurant, they would probably feel right at home. Of course, they did not have ventilation systems like we do, so everyone in the kitchen smelled like smoked meat all day. Still, that was probably better than the alternative odors of the time. Smoking was actually brilliant. They hung meats or fish high in the rafters or special smoke chambers, where smoke slowly dried and coated the food. Different woods gave different flavors. Oak, apple, and cherry were the favorites. One German cookbook even listed which wood matched which meat: oak for beef, apple for pork, and cherry for chicken. Talk about early food science. Archaeologists once uncovered a smokehouse from 1375 in London that still smelled of smoke centuries later. The process really worked. Smoke not only flavored food, but protected it by creating a coating that kept away insects and rot. It was like a natural shield against decay, and it was not limited to meat. They smoked cheese too, which made it last far longer. Some of today's famous smoked cheeses, like Gouda, came from these old techniques. They even smoked grains to prevent mold, though that must have made some interesting tasting bread. One surprising find is that they sometimes smoked eggs. Imagine explaining that to your chickens. Sorry girls, but your eggs are going to smell like a campfire. Wealthy families even had special smokehouses with multiple floors. The top level was for delicate foods like fish, the middle for pork, and the lowest level closest to the fire for tougher meats like beef. It was almost like a medieval parking garage, except filled with meat instead of wagons. When smoke was not enough, people turned to ice and snow. Nature became their freezer. They collected and stored it underground in cellars or special structures. These spaces acted like early refrigerators, except instead of machines, they had servants hauling blocks of frozen water all winter. Rich nobles had actual buildings called ice houses. These were not simple sheds, but deep, thick-walled chambers built partly underground to keep ice from melting. The most impressive one found was at Hampton Court Palace, which could store up to 75 tons of ice. That was enough to chill drinks and desserts for a royal feast, or even cool an army's worth of wine. Ice houses were built like upside-down cones, designed to trap cold air and seal out heat. Some wealthy estates even hired ice masters, whose only job was to make sure the ice lasted through the summer. Medieval food storage might seem primitive by today's standards, but for its time, it was a masterpiece of ingenuity. From salt-covered meats to smoke-scented rafters and underground ice chambers, these people had their own version of refrigeration, and they made it work. That really was a cool job title. Here is a fascinating fact. Medieval ice houses worked so well that some could keep ice frozen for nearly 2 years straight. The secret was sawdust. They packed sawdust between layers of ice, which acted as an ancient form of insulation. You might think your beach cooler is impressive, but these people were keeping ice long after summer had passed. Of course, not everyone could afford a personal underground ice fortress. For regular folks, nature offered a simpler solution. Caves and stone cellars became the next best thing. Natural caves stayed at a steady 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year, perfect for keeping food reasonably fresh. People stored cheese, eggs, and vegetables inside these cool, dark spaces. Some monasteries even carved out artificial caves to chill their wine and beer. Those monks really knew what mattered most. One of the most amusing parts of medieval cold storage was how people used snow during winter feasts. Imagine being a medieval event planner. All right, we need 3 barrels of wine, 2 roasted pigs, and enough snow to keep the fish from spoiling. Oh, and maybe a little extra for snowball fights. They even served frozen desserts at banquets, like early versions of snow cones flavored with honey and fruit juices. And yes, there were warnings like, "Do not eat the yellow snow." Some jokes never lose their charm. But winter always came to an end, unless you lived in a place like medieval Iceland. When the ice melted and the snow disappeared, people needed another plan. That was when they turned to their next best preservation trick, drying everything in sight. And when I say everything, I mean it. They dried whatever they could get their hands on. Meat became jerky, grapes became raisins, and plums became prunes. They would string fruits and vegetables on ropes and hang them from the rafters, making homes look like strange but colorful food displays. Some regions even built tall drying towers with open sides and wooden slats to let air pass through while keeping out birds. One famous example in France could hold more than 2,000 pounds of fruit at once. That is more fruit than most grocery stores stock today. These towers were filled with apples, pears, figs, and berries. Locals called them fruit castles, which sounds way better than food dehydrator. Archaeologists have found some of these structures still standing, with bits of dried fruit stuck in corners that are over 500 years old. Imagine discovering medieval snacks that old. People also developed specific techniques for different foods. Herbs were bundled and hung upside down, giving kitchens the look of indoor gardens. Meat was sliced into paper-thin strips because no one wanted to chew through half-dried beef. Some homes even had special drying rooms with adjustable shutters to control airflow depending on the weather. It was like a primitive version of climate control. Medieval cookbooks contained detailed instructions. One recipe advised, "Cut your meat as thin as a monk's patience during Lent." Another joked, If your dried beef bounces when dropped, it is perfect. If it shatters, it belongs on the battlefield. Fish were also dried, often beaten flat first until they were nearly transparent. The result was so hard, it could double as roof material in an emergency. In fact, sailors in Norway sometimes used dried fish as makeshift plates. Talk about reducing kitchen cleanup. The beauty of dried food was how light it became. A single cow, once dried, could fit into something the size of a modern backpack. That made it perfect for soldiers. Medieval armies loved dried supplies because they could march for weeks without needing wagons full of fresh food. Armies even appointed special officers, known as keepers of the dry stores, to manage their preserved rations. It probably was not the most glamorous title at feasts, but it was an important one. Still, soldiers likely grew tired of the same meal over and over. What is for dinner tonight, Captain? Dried beef. And tomorrow? Dried beef? Next week? Take another guess. But there were times when drying was not enough, especially in places with damp or rainy weather. That was when medieval people turned to their secret weapon, vinegar. The medieval world was obsessed with vinegar and fermentation. You could not step into a kitchen without bumping into barrels bubbling away. They pickled nearly everything imaginable. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and even fish ended up soaking in vinegar. One old German recipe simply said, "Leave it in vinegar until it smells less like fish and more like regret." Historians believe medieval Europeans may have pickled more food per person than any other civilization. The science behind their methods was surprisingly advanced. While modern people avoid spoiled food, medieval cooks learned that letting certain foods go bad in the right way actually made them safer. The good bacteria from fermentation fought off the dangerous kinds that caused sickness. A single barrel of sauerkraut could feed a family through the winter and keep them healthy with enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. In other words, medieval people were protecting themselves from pirate diseases before pirates were even popular. Tests on ancient recipes show their fermented foods contained more beneficial bacteria than most modern probiotic supplements. Some monasteries even dedicated entire rooms to fermentation, filled with barrels quietly bubbling away like medieval science experiments. They might not have had refrigerators, but their creativity kept food fresh, tasty, and safe for months at a time. The monks were meticulous record keepers, and thanks to their detailed notes, we know that one monastery in France managed to pickle more than 15,000 eggs in a single year. Imagine being the unfortunate monk assigned to that task. "Brother John, what is your sacred duty?" "I pickle eggs, thousands upon thousands of them. My hands always smell like vinegar, and I have not tasted anything else in years." Some monks even wrote poetry about their pickling adventures. One of these works went on for 50 verses, entirely about how to ferment turnips correctly. But if the monks were dedicated, the true masters of fermentation were the Vikings. These northern warriors took the art of preservation to a level that was both impressive and horrifying. They created something called lutefisk, which was fish soaked in lye until it turned into a jelly-like substance. Yes, you read that correctly. They intentionally transformed perfectly fine fish into wobbly fish jelly. Even more surprising, they considered it a delicacy. There is an Old Norse saying that roughly translates to, "A brave man fears many things, but only a fool fears not the lutefisk." Archaeologists have discovered Viking barrels that still hold traces of this fermented fish after 1,000 years. Thankfully, no one has been reckless enough to taste them. The best thing about fermented food was that it improved with time, unlike that forgotten sandwich at the bottom of your bag. Some noble families kept barrels of pickled vegetables for generations, treating them like prized possessions. Imagine a father telling his son, "I now pass to you this sacred barrel of pickled turnips. It was your great-grandfather's final wish that you keep adding vinegar." In one English castle, a barrel of pickled cabbage had been maintained continuously for over 40 years. Fermentation was not just for eating either. It played a role in medieval medicine. Got a headache? Drink some fermented cabbage juice. Upset stomach? Try a spoonful of pickled radish. Medieval physicians prescribed fermented foods for nearly every ailment, from fevers to broken bones. It seems when all you have is a barrel of pickles, every problem looks like something vinegar can fix. One hospital recorded using more than 50 gallons of fermented vegetable juice each month, though it remains uncertain whether that healed the patients or simply gave them something new to complain about. But when it came to long-term preservation, there was an even sweeter solution: honey. The most remarkable thing about honey is that it never spoils, ever. Archaeologists have found honey that was over 3,000 years old in Egyptian tombs and still edible, though eating tomb snacks probably is not a good idea. Medieval people understood honey's unique powers and used it on almost everything. They covered fruits, meats, and even entire birds with it. One recipe suggested preserving an entire peacock in honey, apparently because an ordinary chicken just would not impress the guests. Beekeepers were highly respected and often protected by law. They could even trespass on private land if they were chasing after their bees. Records from an English manor show that the resident beekeeper earned more than the cook, which says everything about how valuable honey was. A skilled beekeeper could manage up to 100 hives, enough to supply a whole village with honey for food preservation and medicine. Honey also doubled as a healing remedy. Got a cut? Apply some honey. Trouble sleeping? Mix it with warm milk. Suffering from the plague? Well, honey would not save you, but they still gave it a try. Medieval doctors wrote entire treatises about honey-based cures. One physician claimed honey water could heal everything from toothaches to heartache, though perhaps the heartbroken would have preferred chocolate instead. Some medieval castles even had special honey rooms. These were warm, dry chambers where honey-preserved foods were stored. Over time, the walls would become sticky from dripping honey, trapping insects like natural flypaper. Records from one castle mention that every spring, servants had to scrape the walls clean because the honey room has caught more flies than food. For the wealthy, honey became a symbol of luxury. They preserved rare fruits in it to flaunt their wealth. Oh, you have never tasted honey-preserved lemons from Sicily? How quaint! At lavish feasts, these golden treats were served to impress guests and remind everyone who could afford the finest delicacies. Some nobles even collected jars of preserved fruits like prized treasures, a kind of medieval version of collectible cards. To ensure their honey was pure enough for preserving, people used a rather unusual test. They would drop a feather into it. If it sank too fast, the honey was too thin. A medieval cookbook warned, if your honey cannot hold a feather, it cannot hold your supper. Many even believed that honey made by bees who visited holy sites was more powerful, as if divine bees produced holier honey. But what if you wanted to preserve food and have a bit of fun too? That is where alcohol came into the picture. Nothing says preserve your dinner quite like soaking it in wine. Medieval cooks discovered that alcohol was an excellent preservative, not just a drink for celebration. Fruits, vegetables, and even eggs could be stored for months when submerged in wine or beer. Some French castles used over 100,000 liters of wine every year, and only half of that was for drinking. The rest went into preserving food, from cherries to entire geese. Their reasoning was simple. If wine kept people feeling good, maybe it could keep food good too. And as it turned out, they were right. The alcohol killed harmful bacteria and stopped spoilage. Several monasteries even had entire cellars devoted to alcohol-preserved foods. The monks would spend their days preparing barrels of wine-soaked fruits and then write poetry about the process. For them, it was the perfect blend of devotion, science, and a little bit of fun, a reminder that medieval food preservation was as much about creativity as it was about survival. Talk about truly living it up in medieval style. Among all the preserved delights, none were more beloved than the so-called drunken fruits. Think of them as the medieval version of cocktail toppings. People soaked cherries, plums, and peaches in spiced wine until they became sweet, boozy little flavor explosions. One old recipe even warned, "These fruits shall make thee twice as cheerful as ordinary fruits." They sometimes used alcohol to preserve meat too, though that seemed to come more from necessity than taste. Nothing screams, "We are running out of options," quite like a chicken bobbing in a barrel of ale. Here is a strange one for you. They also preserved eggs in alcohol. The cook would crack eggs into barrels of beer or wine, where they would slowly begin to pickle. Medieval taverns actually served these wine-soaked eggs as snacks at the bar, because plain pickled eggs were apparently too boring. There is a story about a merchant who tried to eat 3 of these eggs on a dare, and ended up singing tavern songs in Latin, despite not knowing a single Latin word. The wealthier classes took alcohol preservation to a whole new level of creativity. They would layer fruits in jars filled with various wines to make colorful patterns. One noble family even kept a massive barrel filled with alternating layers of red and white wine, turning it into a kind of edible striped flag. It was practically the medieval version of an Instagram post. Records from a royal kitchen reveal that they spent more money on wine used for preservation than on meat itself, though knowing how royals lived, they probably drank half of it anyway. But the most remarkable discovery came when they realized that stronger alcohol worked better for keeping food fresh. This revelation led to some very enthusiastic experiments in distillation. "No, no, my lord." You can almost imagine a servant saying, "This is not for pleasure. It is for preserving the royal pears." Right, very important pears indeed. And that, in all its glory, was medieval preservation at its finest. From ordinary salt to luxurious wine, people of the Middle Ages mastered 7 different ways to make food last through harsh winters and endless shortages. So the next time you open your refrigerator, take a moment to thank your medieval ancestors for inventing all these clever tricks to keep food safe and tasty. Just maybe do yourself a favor and skip the wine-soaked eggs.